So Digitakt II came out earlier this year. Awesome box, awesome upgrade. It did not have Overbridge when it launched, so I wasn't able to talk about Overbridge. But now, after a couple weeks, or the past 3 weeks, Overbridge is officially in Digitakt II. You do have to update the firmware, so if you haven't done that yet, grab the new firmware, and then you can install the Overbridge engine from Electron and have all the communication working properly with your Digitakt to the computer and all that stuff. Also, you got to go to Settings, and then System, USB config, and make sure it's in Overbridge for this to work. If that's set to USB MIDI or USB audio MIDI, it's not gonna work. So something to keep in mind right there. So yeah, I want to get my thoughts on Overbridge because it does seem like the perfect solution. And it's close, but not quite there in a few ways. I'm by no means saying it's bad, not saying that at all, but it's not perfect. So if you're thinking Overbridge is gonna solve all the issues that you may have with the limitations of your Digitakt, might not exactly be the case. So let's get to it. First off, there's a couple ways that you could use Overbridge in this sense, and I'm going to show you the plugin version first. So I have Ableton Live set up here. If I pull out Digitakt, open this up, and then I have the nice plugin interface. I can also make it bigger, which is nice. We'll make this pretty big for the sake of this video. So it's basically a Digitakt plugin at this point, which is really cool. You get access to basically all of the features. By the way, I'm going to turn the volume of the Digitakt completely down. Even though I have cables plugged in at the moment, that is for a reason, but for now I'm turning the volume all the way down. So you can hear what is coming out of the Digitakt into the plugin through Overbridge, which is pretty cool. So even using the interface right here, you can see that the tracks are switching as I'm selecting the different tracks on the hardware itself. So the communication back and forth with Overbridge and the device is actually awesome. Like, well done, Electron. I mean, this has been in the past boxes as well. This was in the original Digitakt Mark I, basically all of them, except for like the Octatracks, I think, that are modern Electron devices right now. Side note, if anybody from Korg is listening, I would love the OP6 and the ModWave to do exactly this with the hardware integration. So just throwing that out there. So on the surface, this is extremely slick. You know, you have basically access to everything. And actually what feels like more because you can actually see all of the samples and your factory content and all that. And you can go into the sound browser right here, load up samples directly to the tracks. It's very slick, really cool. So you might be wondering like, what type of downsides are to this integration? Because is there any? And the main one that I've seen so far in the plugin version is the fact that it introduces quite a bit of latency. If you see on the bottom of the Ableton screen, this is introducing 47 milliseconds of latency, which if you are aware, that is actually quite a bit of latency to feel in the signal when you're playing stuff. And just for reference, I am currently in 44.1 and also 64 samples. If I drop this down to 32 samples with my 828 ES, 44.7. And that was kind of my main issue with the Analog Heat Plus Effects, is that when you use it in this plugin format, it pumps up the latency right there. So if you are sensitive to that stuff when you're performing and playing and all that, then it's going to cause issues. Like let's say you have a project open and you want to track some vocals, all right? So your vocalist puts on headphones, has the mic set up, and you're monitoring the vocals through Ableton Live so you can process effects and all that. They're definitely going to notice a 47 millisecond delay in their headphones. So it's going to feel weird. They might be like, whoa, something's off here, if they're used to recording vocals in headphones. So that is one knock, one issue that I see right there. It also means you can't really have anything higher than 64. Really, well, I mean, you could have higher than 64, but it's just going to increase the latency. If I go 256, 65 milliseconds at that point in this particular setup. Future Tefty here. I missed some information, so I decided to repost this video, do a little quick edit. And one of the big details is there's actually an Overbridge control panel, and this allows you to adjust the plugin buffer size. So if you go into Electron Overbridge control panel, and then if you click on these settings, you can actually adjust plugin buffer size. So right now it's at 128. You can actually adjust it down to 64. And the buffer safety margin right here. So it's at 100. I believe this is the default. It might actually be 256. I can't remember. But this basically produces 44 milliseconds of delay in Ableton Live. Now I can drop this lower to 64 and I can drop this margin down. But what I found is I start getting a lot more clicks and pops and glitches. And on top of that, the latency is still not the best. So if you look at the latency now, it is at 32 milliseconds, 32.9 milliseconds. It was at like 44, 47, stuff like that. So while yes, you will get some savings in the latency, having the plugin buffer size and the buffer safety margin just doesn't do enough to make it feel like it's real time. Shout out to Zazilla the Great for the Overbridge control panel information. By the way, I'm on an Apple M1 Max Mac Studio computer. In case you're wondering what type of computer this is. That is con number one and the big one that I see for live interaction. The other thing is that because there's so much latency involved with the Overbridge side, Electron, I believe, has stated when you first open up the app that they don't recommend using the sequencer when it's in this mode if you're syncing with other tracks inside Ableton. So if you're thinking you're going to like load up the plugin and then sync up a bunch of other VSTs like Pigments or something like that, it's probably going to have some issues if you're using the sequencer on the Digitakt. So it's a bit unfortunate because you're thinking, oh, I could combine the sequencer of the Digitakt with the experience of Ableton Live and, you know, do all kinds of tricks like that, do all kinds of like syncing tricks. It's not exactly going to be reliable for, you know, acute micro timing and all that. It's going to be off. Not to say that you can't do that, because you absolutely could go ahead and deal with those issues. You know, it's music production, anything goes. So feel free to try it if you're in the position, because nothing wrong with that. But it's not recommended. The other thing on the Ableton side is if you look at the Digitakt plugin and then go to the inputs here for what you can track out, it doesn't give you track 16 or the effects or the input specifically. And I believe this is an issue with Ableton, not an issue with Electron and their plugin or anything like that. I believe this is something that Ableton has an issue with. So if you are an Ableton user, which I know a lot of people like to combine Digitakt with Ableton, that could be an issue if you're trying to utilize all 16 tracks and trying to separate out the inputs from some other device. In fact, off to my side, I have a Digitone Mark I and an Analog Heat Plus Effects hooked up to the side to do some testing to showcase some of this routing that can happen. This is just for demonstration's sake. It could be any synthesizer, honestly, that could go into the inputs. But it is cool being able to route audio into a box that is technically a plugin inside your DAW using a separate audio interface. So I'm currently using a Motu 828ES off to the side, and then the Digitakt Mark II plugin can take the input right here and have sound come through. So for instance, I'm going to go to like a random bank here, bank 2, E2, and then I'm going to go to the external in. You can see external in is completely down. So if we go like this, you're not hearing anything. If I start turning it up, sorry, I'm gonna get lost here. So as you can hear, the inputs of the left-right are going directly to the output of the Digitakt plugin. Again, the master volume on the Digitakt II is completely down, and I have the plugin loaded up right here. And you can see on the mixer page, which shows all the tracks, you can see on the external in that I have control over this right here. Can even add the effects to it as well, if I wanted. So that's pretty cool. Now you might be wondering, how do you separate out the other tracks from the stereo input? Well, basically, you just have to mute them. So if I go to track 1 right here, and then I go to the source page, you can see the level is completely down. If I bring it up, you start to hear. So that's going through the main out of the Digitakt plugin inside Ableton. Now in Ableton, this is how you get access to the other tracks, okay? So let's say I want access to track 12, but I don't want it coming out of the main output of the Digitakt plugin. You have to have another audio track, which I do right here, audio track 3. And then I make sure the audio is coming from the Digitakt plugin. That's step 2. And then step 3 is choosing which input. So track 12, you can see right here, it says track 12 Digitakt II. And you can see some metering right there that tells you it's getting some audio information. And then I just input monitor. Very cool. So now it's a dry signal that's coming out of there that I can completely affect on its own with my own effects. Just maybe put some roar on there. Maybe a glue compressor. A little Valhalla delay. So that's how you would split out all the tracks. You'd have to make a new audio track for each one of these. You have to go to Digitakt II plugin and then choose which track. And again, keep in mind that with the limitation with Ableton, for some reason in 2024, you can't access the 16th track and then the additional input and buses for the effects and all that. So it's definitely strange that Ableton is not up to date with whatever infrastructure stuff that is. But that's the case at the moment. You know, I just realized I am only using the audio unit version. It's possible it could be different in the VST version, but I don't know. If the VST 3 version does actually give you full access in Ableton, let me know in the comments. Appreciate it. Thank you. Also, the transport controls are synced when in Overbridge mode and in plugin mode, which is cool as well. So if I hit play in Ableton, you'll notice this starts playing. Great, right? But what if you don't want that to happen? So if I stop this and then go into the Digitakt plugin, you'll see a sync option up here. You have clock plus transport, which is the default, I believe. Then you have clock and then no sync. Future Tefty again. So on the no sync side of things, if you have no sync selected in Ableton Live, and if you play Ableton Live and you still have Digitakt respond, there is a very simple reason for this, and I totally missed it the first time I recorded this, but basically you go into settings, you go into MIDI config, and then sync, and then you make sure clock receive and transport receive is off, because most likely Ableton is still sending clock information via the MIDI connection through Overbridge, not the Overbridge plugin specifically. So I missed that in my first time going around in this video, but I wanted to make sure that was very clear for anybody wondering. And it could be a gotcha moment where you're thinking, hey, this no sync is no syncing, yet it's still playing. And that's the reason for that. So shout out to Yan Lian for the insight on the no sync problem that I was having on the previous video. I think that about wraps up the plugin side of things. Again, I just briefly covered the sound browser type thing, but this is honestly really cool. So if I'm on track 2 and I hit keyboard mode, now I can literally just double click anything here. Atmosphere. Then if you go back over to the kit editor and go to assign samples, you can see the samples that are inside the drive of the Digitakt. You can see stuff that I've sampled. So, plugin version of Overbridge is very cool with some strong caveats that you have to keep in mind. It does not solve everything that you think is the problem or could be the problems with the Digitakt. The biggest one is the fact that the sequencer doesn't really mesh that well with the actual sequencer of Ableton in this mode. To be fair, I haven't really done a lot of testing in this realm beyond that. I just took Electron's word for it, and they recommended that, you need to keep your clock in Ableton for things to sync up properly. And Osans did mention you can actually route out a MIDI connection from your DAW into the input of the Digitakt while it's in Overbridge mode and no sync is on with the plugin. So then you could sync technically from the DAW to the Digitakt and any other hardware that you have hooked up with your DAW to have a much larger setup that's also being interacted with in the DAW environment. So if you're willing to do some sussing out in the details, you could definitely do some very fascinating combinations of gear and make them all connect correctly with Overbridge in mind. There is another way of working though, and I will show you. So I'm just gonna make a new live set real quick. And then I'm gonna swap over. I'm gonna do no device first because when I go from the 828ES directly to the Digitakt audio interface, it like freaks out. So I'm not gonna do that. So I reset the devices. Now I'm going Digitakt II on the input and Digitakt II on the output. And this is why I have these plugged in, because I now have this box acting as if it's the audio interface for Ableton Live, which is very cool. So again, 42 inputs and 42 outputs. So if you look at this, there is quite a few things being registered right here. I'm going to turn this up so you can hear it. So some things to note. Track 1 is 3/4 on this audio interface. Track 2 is 5/6. Track 1/2 is the master output with the compressor and all that. So if you want that master compressor and the master output of everything, track 1/2 gets the job done right there if you want to record that. Additionally, what's nice is you do have access to the effects as well. So if I put up the delay, you'll see delay is 3556, and you might be wondering what's 4142. It is the external input. So if I take 4142 and go in, It's also very low for some reason, which I don't know why. Seems like it's coming in significantly lower than it should be. So what this does is offer a more direct route to be able to record stuff that's just directly inside the Digitakt II. Because you might be wondering, why use the plugin method if you're just going to track out when you could do this, right? So with this method, the Digitakt is the main audio interface connection to Ableton. So you can explode out 16 tracks easily, and you can take the input as well if you want. And then you could even take the buses of reverb, delay, and chorus if you want. Now, once again, the main reason to do this is so you have access to all the plugins and effects and tools inside of a DAW like Ableton to be able to finish your mix. So I don't think you really need the delay, reverb, chorus inside of Digitakt. But again, it is there. So if you do want it, it's there. You can capture it. But yeah, so in comparison to this versus the plugin version, you might be thinking, why would you use the plugin version when you can easily just load this up and have the channels directly activated like this to be able to jump in? The reason why you might not want this version and you might prefer the version in the plugin is you might have other pieces of gear set up. And that's where you can actually get some really interesting concepts going here, some interesting jam setups, because I'm a big fan of hardware jams. One of my preferred methods is basically to craft a jam, the DAW-less experience, and then I like to multi-track everything inside of a DAW, which gives me the freedom to do the tweaking and mixing afterwards. Because I find that I make mistakes easier when I'm in the middle of producing something sonically, and then I come back a day or two later and I wish I would adjust things subtly. So I find for me, having that next day or 2 days later, whatever perspective, being extremely valuable. You might be the type of person that just wants to get it all done, and more power to you. Just track out the left, right. Don't even worry about this stuff. You're done, right? But for those of us that want a bit more control in our final mixes, or you want more finesse in the arrangement afterwards, if you feel like you made a mistake or something, then this method really offers some incredible flexibility while still maintaining the feel of a hardware jam. So again, with this as an audio interface directly into Ableton, it is fantastic if you're just using the Digitakt with all the stuff inside of it, you know? So if you're just gonna use these 16 tracks and maybe one additional synthesizer plugged in with the left or right, then this is a fantastic way to multi-track into Ableton. But if you want your Digitakt to be the main brain of a sequence, along with multi-tracking out the tracks that are being used as samples, then what you could do is say, like the Digitakt 1, have the first 8 tracks be sample-based, and those go into Ableton through the plugin, and then whatever additional synthesizers that you may have around you that are getting triggered via MIDI inside the Digitakt and then producing audio can be captured with your audio interface. That's actually how I'm predominantly using the MPC right now. I'll have the MPC trigger a few samples, usually drums, and then I'll have it control the MIDI sequences of all the hardware instruments that are then sending audio to an interface that I multi-track inside of Ableton. I've been doing this method for a few years and I really, really like it, because when I get to the mix stage in Ableton, I feel like it's a different process. And I can also take individual tracks and bust them out to hardware compressors and equalizers. That's my personal method that I really enjoy. If that all sounds way too confusing or way too complex, or just, you know, what's the purpose going through all that? Again, there's no right or wrong way to go about getting the end result of whatever track you're making. It's just nuance and preference when it comes to music production. Before I wrap this up, there is a final third option that I should mention that I actually personally haven't tested yet. So forgive my ignorance on this. There is an option to go into the standalone Digitakt app. So you have Overbridge active on your Digitakt hardware, plugged into your computer, and then you have the application open up on the computer. You can then use this multi-track feature right here, the audio capture, to capture everything. So you don't necessarily need this plugged into a DAW to be able to capture all the tracks. You could actually just get the raw files this way. Definitely an option, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, so my apologies for that. But yes, I need to wrap up this video. Hopefully you found this information useful. If you did, a like and subscribe goes a long way for the algorithm. And also, if you're planning on picking up a Digitakt or any gear for that matter, if you use my affiliate links below, then it directly supports the channel without any additional cost to you. So thank you very much if you do that. But that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time for another one. Peace.